Hello everyone, welcome to my channel English Literature Made Easy with Saswati. In today's video, I will talk about Virginia Woolf's essay, A Room of One's Own. First, I will give you some of the background information to the essay. Then I will talk about the title of the essay. And finally, I will give you detailed, crisp, chapter-wise analysis of all the chapters of the essay. So do stay tuned and watch the video till the end. So first, let's look at some of the important background informations of the essay, A Room of One's Own. In the year 1928, Virginia Woolf was asked to give a lecture on the topic of women and fiction at two women's colleges. They are Newnham College and Girton College at the University of Cambridge. This essay, A Room of One's Own, is based on these two lecture series by Woolf. This essay was published as a book in the year 1929 with 6 chapters. Now let's look at the title of the essay. The title of the essay is A Room of One's Own, and it comes from Woolf's idea that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she wants to write fiction. That means a woman fiction writer must have financial independence and she must have a private space or a private room of her own so that she can think and write without any interruptions. So Woolf builds her essay around this central argument, and in the chapters of the essay she gives reasons in support of this argument. Now let's look at the narrator of the essay. Virginia Woolf speaks as herself in the essay, but sometimes she adopts the voice of a narrator, and these narrators are the 4 Marys. However, the name of the narrator is not very important because she represents every woman, and with this Woolf gives us the sense that we all are joined together in this collective narrative. So the 4 Marys are Mary Batten, Mary Sutton and Mary Carmichael, and these 4 Marys are ladies in waiting to Mary, Queen of Scots. But please remember that all these characters are fictional characters. Now let's look at the setting of the chapter 1 of the essay. The setting of the essay is the fictional University of Oxbridge. Oxbridge is the hybrid name for the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge. Now please remember that it was William Thackeray who used the term Oxbridge for the first time in his novel Pendennis, which was published in the year 1850. Virginia Woolf uses this hybrid name Oxbridge in the essay A Room of One's Own, citing William Thackeray. Now let's look at the detailed analysis of the essay. Chapter 1 begins with the narrator sitting on the bank of a river at the University of Oxbridge, trying to formulate her lecture on the topic Women and Fiction. She is wondering how to begin, and she uses the metaphor of fishing for all her thoughts and musings. Since the topic is women and fiction, so she is wondering that she will include fiction written by women and fiction about women. But as soon as she gets a bait, that means as soon as she arrives at a thought, she is interrupted by a university security guard who happens to be a man, and he enforces the rule that women are not allowed to walk onto the college lawns. It shows how the university is protected by man for man, and in the process how it excludes women from pursuing their thoughts. She is similarly shut out from the university library, as ladies are not admitted to the library if they are not accompanied by a male fellow of the college. The narrator realizes that this denial of access to buildings or uninterrupted thinking is an infringement on the freedom of the female mind. It is lunchtime, and the narrator describes going to a lunch party at the university. She is inspired by the feast of food, wine and bright conversation there, and she moves to a window seat after lunch. There she notices a cat without a tail, which looks out of the place in that opulent surrounding. This tailless cat reminds her of some kind of a lack that is seen in the society after the First World War. Despite the sumptuous lunch, she senses this lack in the conversations around her and the kind of poetry that has come out of this time. She concludes that the romantic view of a Tennyson or a Rossetti no longer seem possible, in that post-war era. The new poetry expresses the post-war disillusionment which the readers cannot respond with the same familiarity and comfort as they did before. Later, she eats dinner at the fictional Fernham Women's College and finds out that the meal at Fernham is in complete contrast to the grand lunch party she had earlier in the day. The meal at Fernham Women's College is very simple, comprising of prunes and custard only, and the conversation is gossipy and uninteresting. The narrator then retires to the room of her friend Mary Seton with a feeling of disappointment. The two realize that women's colleges lack financial and political support that have been generously offered to male universities. And the result is women have been put outside of education and the financial and intellectual legacy that men have had easy access to. In chapter 2, the scene changes from Oxbridge to London, where the narrator goes to the British Library to find answer to some questions. And these questions are: number 1, why did men drink wine and women water? Number 2, why was one sex so prosperous and the other so poor? Unlike the Oxbridge Library, where she was not allowed access, she is welcome in the British Library and Museum. However, she soon finds out that it is a masculine institution throughout. The dome of the library is depicted as the bald head of the professor. The narrator is surprised to see that while there is hardly any book written by women, most of the books written by men are about women. And it shows two things. Number 1, it shows the absence of women authors in literature and in history. And number 2, male authors tend to write more on the topic of women than men. So she questions why men would be so interested in women. In order to find out the answer, she arbitrarily selects a few books, and she is furious with Professor Von X's book titled The Mental, Moral and Physical Inferiority of the Female Sex. The narrator considers the relationship between men and women before the women's rights movement and how it is now. She says that people like Effie Smith, who is referred to as Lord Birkenhead, were opposed to women's suffrage. Please remember that the year 1928 was the year that allowed women the right to vote in Britain, and it was something absolutely monumental given the years of relentless struggle women had put for this right. Virginia Woolf was undoubtedly influenced by this political right achieved by women of her time, and she conceived these lectures around this particularly important time. Woolf argues that men are angry now because their superiority, which they have taken for granted for all these years, is being questioned and challenged by feminists and women's rights movement activists. She concludes that men have used their scholarship and literature to affirm the inferiority of women so that they can secure their own superiority. In that sense, women have always served as mirrors to men for centuries. The narrator informs us that she was left with a legacy of £500 a year by her aunt Mary Beton around the same time that women were granted the voting rights. And she observes that this inheritance was very important in securing her financial freedom. And not just that, it relieved her of the obligation to do odd jobs, and it allowed her to forgive men for all their collective injustices toward women and see males too as victims in some ways of their education and culture. So it is chapter 3 now, but the narrator is still struggling to find answers to questions like why women are so poor compared to men and what is the effect of poverty on fiction. She returns home and turns to history this time because history records not opinions but facts. She looks into the lives of English women during the Elizabethan period as it was an era of surpassing literary accomplishment. But even history seems to be biased, as this accomplishment was shown only among men, while women were systematically omitted from history. To fill in this gap in the historical record and to reconstruct the experience of 16th century women, the narrator creates the imaginary character of Judith Shakespeare, the gifted fictional sister of William Shakespeare. The narrator remembers an old gentleman saying that no women could have written the plays of Shakespeare, and she agrees. It would have been impossible for any woman to have written Shakespeare in the age of Shakespeare. The narrator points out that genius depends on certain conditions, and these conditions are material conditions and social conditions. When William established himself as an actor in London, Judith was trapped by what was expected of women. She was betrothed to a neighbor, and in order to avoid the marriage, she ran away to London. She was as gifted as he was and wanted to be an actor, but she was told that women did not act, and she was laughed at when she tried to be one. Finally, she was made pregnant by an actor manager who said that he would help her. But harassed and unable to express her gifts, she killed herself. So as you can see, it would have been impossible for a woman in Shakespeare's time to write plays, as she neither had education nor financial freedom nor social advantages that men had enjoyed. Gifted women could either kill themselves or become outcasts or prostitutes, as there was no way back in the 16th century for women to obtain the things they needed to become writer. In chapter 4, the narrator traces the gradual emergence of women writers out of the blank past to the 19th century. She mentions about Lady Winchelsea and Margaret of Newcastle, who were not taken seriously simply because they were women. However, with Aphra Behn in the 17th century, the narrator identifies a turning point. She was a middle-class woman who made money through her writing in defiance of the conventions of the society. It was she who paved the way for the likes of Jane Austen and George Eliot in the later 18th and 19th centuries respectively. However, even these women writers were not taken seriously, and they often had to hide their work. Jane Austen used to hide her work whenever anyone entered the room. George Eliot was the pen name of Mary Ann Evans. She had to hide behind a male pseudonym in order to get her works published without ridicule. Also, the Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, wrote under masculine pseudonyms known as Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell, respectively. Hence, Woolf says, for most of history, Anonymous was a woman. But of course, a lot of women writers started writing owing to the success of Aphra Behn by the beginning of the 19th century. But these motherless women turned to the genre of novel as it was the newest literary form, and they tried to make it fit their needs. In chapter 5, the narrator Mary Benton talks about her own time, that is, the early 20th century, when women write books as much as men, and they write on almost all subjects, unlike the 19th century when women wrote mostly novels. In order to talk about the change that has occurred in women's writing in her own generation, the narrator invents an imaginary author named Mary Carmichael and analyzes her book Life's Adventure. The narrator compares the writings of Mary Carmichael with the writings of Jane Austen and finds that Miss Carmichael's writing has nothing in common with Austen's. She is attempting something completely different, and it gives rise to women's experimental writing in the 20th century. The smooth movement of sentence after sentence seen in the writings of Jane Austen or George Eliot is interrupted. Sentence and their sequence is broken in order to create a new style of writing in the 20th century. Until the 19th century, women were always considered in their relationship to men. But Carmichael breaks this kind of gender stereotypical relationships. The decisive moment in Mary Carmichael's innovation comes with the words, "Chloe liked Olivia." So she shows these two women to be friends and colleagues who work together in a laboratory, and with it, she asserts that women have meaningful interests outside the home. Mary Carmichael may not have the genius of Jane Austen or Eliot, but as a writer, she has some advantages. She no longer fears and hates men as writers before her did. And the reason is she now enjoys relative freedom. The narrator is hopeful that with £500 a year and the room of her own, this Mary Carmichael can even write better. And she may use writing as an art, not just as a method of self-expression. With this, Woolf makes an assessment of the transition in women's literature at the time, as well as transition in women's role in society. In chapter 6, the narrator looks out at the London street in the morning and notices a man and a woman meeting and getting into a cab, and For her, this particular image symbolizes the unification of men and women. It is similar to Coleridge's theory of the androgynous mind. He said that the great mind is androgynous, in which there is a natural harmonious balance of masculine and feminine aspects. Such a mind is naturally creative and undivided, like Shakespeare. Woolf points out that sex consciousness is a flaw of the society and literature of her time. If everyone were open to the different sexes and allowed themselves this unification of the mind, then they would not be offended by maleness or femaleness, and one sex would not have to write books criticizing the other. On the contrary, there would be mutual understanding and respect for one another. To conclude the essay, Virginia Woolf directly addresses her audience in Newnham and Girton colleges and makes two important points. The first one is intellectual freedom depends on material things. Number two, poetry or any writing depends on intellectual freedom. For Woolf, material things meant financial freedom and a private space or room where a woman can think and write without any interruptions. The reason why Woolf is repeating these two things is women were at a disadvantage because they had been very poor from the beginning of time, hence they did not have a chance to write without any distractions. So it is very important for a woman to have money and a room of her own if she wishes to write. And she write without distractions. So she sums up her essay by urging her audience to create a legacy for their daughters. She urges them to write books of all kinds, poetry, fiction, everything, because books have a way of influencing each other and it will prepare women writers to write. She brings forth the image of Judith Shakespeare lying dead, but she asserts that all is not lost for this tragic character. It is through their writing that the women writers can bring Judith to life, as books and poetry have the power to immortalize people. So she urges the women in her audience to bring Judith to life and create the history that Judith never had. So that's all for this video. I hope you liked the video, and if you like the video, then do give it a big fat thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so that you receive all the updates about my upcoming videos. And also do follow me on Instagram and my Facebook page, English Literature Made Easy with Saswati, to get literary updates and quizzes every day. So take care of yourselves, and I will see you real soon in another video with a new topic. Bye bye.